Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Historic Register Workshop with Historic Tacoma and the City of Tacoma. We're going to wait a few more minutes here for a few more folks to join. We're a little bit early, I think. So we'll just give it a few. All right. Well, welcome, everyone, to our workshop on historic registers and historic preservation. My name is Jennifer or Jay Mortensen, and tonight I wear multiple hats in the preservation world, but tonight I'm speaking as a Historic Tacoma board member. Historic Tacoma is a local nonprofit, and we are presenting this workshop in partnership with the City of Tacoma and with funding support from both Tacoma Creates and the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, which is our state historic preservation office. So thank you to all of our partners. And we've got Lauren, who came here from the city, attending in case we have any questions that need a little bit more of her expertise. She works with the city office, the City Historic Preservation Office. So she's here on hand for any questions that I might need to toss her way. We'll go ahead and introduce Historic Tacoma. If you haven't heard of us, we are a local nonprofit advocacy group, and you can see our mission statement here. But essentially, we are concerned with preserving historic places in Tacoma and helping preserve those memories that those historic places embody in our community. And some people might get us confused with the Tacoma Historical Society, which is another great local nonprofit. They are more focused mission-wise on kind of archives and artifacts and photographs and those types of things, whereas Historic Tacoma is really focused on that built environment and preserving those historic places. Also, Historic Tacoma is all volunteer run, and I know the Tacoma Historical Society has a couple of staff, and they do a lot of really great programming and wonderful things like that, and they're a frequent partner of ours also. So it's understandable that folks might get things confused a little bit, but that's just a quick clarification on that. This workshop is presented as part of our McKinney History Project partnership with the city and Tacoma Creates and the DAHP, the State Department. So as part of this project, we're doing a building inventory of the McKinney neighborhood, basically looking at that downtown business core of McKinney and seeing what buildings are there, you know, what year were they built, and doing that first step, which is called an inventory of just kind of looking at the whole picture and what are the pieces and what's kind of the timeline of the history and all those things. Hopefully you all were able to join us for our intro tour with Pretty Gritty tours. That was super fun to learn a lot about the history of McKinney. And then one of our next workshops will be kind of reporting back on the inventory and what we learned through doing a little bit more research about that core. If you want to know more, you can visit this link, historictacoma.org/McKinney. It's got all the information there, and we'll continue to post links to these videos and other resources as they become available throughout the project. So actually, let me scoot forward to this one. I created a slide with logos. So one of the things that I wanted to do tonight was really clarify who's who in the preservation world, because this can get very confusing for folks who aren't kind of steeped in it every day, like folks like myself, who work in preservation and volunteer on the Landmarks Commission and all that great stuff. So you see I've got this chart listed out by national, state, and local. And then on the side, nonprofit government, and then I've got kind of other, I previously called it private, but really nonprofits are also private. So I kind of have it as other in the sense that there are a lot of other folks that are involved in preservation, not just government and nonprofit, but individuals, community groups, property owners, developers, all those folks that also really help make preservation happen. So you can see on the nonprofit level, there's the National Trust, there's the Washington Trust on the state level, and we're Historic Tacoma on the local level. And then for the government level, the National Park Service houses all of our national preservation management. DAHP, the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, is our statewide historic preservation office. So they're our state level government entity. And then within the city of Tacoma, we have our very own historic preservation office, which is who locally manages preservation for the city. So this is a quick breakdown of who's who, and a little bit more about kind of what the different, kind of the big difference between our local preservation folks of Historic Tacoma as the nonprofit and the city as our government entity. So Historic Tacoma has a mission to save places and build community. So we've got a watch list of endangered places. We've nominated buildings to the register ourselves as an advocacy group. We do education outreach like this program tonight and the McKinley History Project, walking tours. We have lots of great architectural guides on our website, lots of great stuff. Partnerships like the McKinley History Project, like I mentioned, and also preservation policy advocacy. So our board president attends our state heritage caucus, and as a nonprofit, we do comment on policy issues involving preservation and make sure that the state and the city are making good decisions when it comes to preserving historic places. And on the city side, you've got official review, kind of like permitting and applications, maintaining the historic register for the city, staffing the Landmarks Commission. The city also offers certain areas of funding support like community grants and a special tax valuation program for property owners, which I'll talk a lot about that in a little bit later. And then the city also does education and outreach and events, particularly right now we're wrapping up Preservation Month. There's a bunch of great events happening this week with our preservation awards happening at the end of the week. So definitely check out the city's Facebook page for more on that. But that just shows you there is quite a bit of partnership. So there's a little bit of overlap with outreach and education, but a lot of the missions are very kind of different between the advocacy piece and then the kind of management of the city register and reviews of permits and things like that. And Lauren's putting great links in the chat. So if you're interested in any of the things that I'm mentioning, be sure to click on those. And I also didn't mention at the beginning, if you do have questions, please do feel free to throw those in the Q&A and we'll get to those at the end. I'll try to end like 10-15 minutes before the hour to address those. So first I want to talk about preservation advocacy, that kind of nonprofit side of historic preservation briefly. This actually is a slide from a presentation that I gave in my former role with the Washington Trust, which is the statewide advocacy group. So these are statewide examples here. But a few of the points that I want to get across tonight are that preservation takes time. When you come at Historic Tacoma or the city or other groups in the 11th hour, you know, the bulldozer, the wrecking ball is at the door. It's usually a little bit too late. You know, that it's gone through the process it needs to go through to get that permit for demolition. So it really takes time, and you want to make sure that you're paying attention and starting early. If there are buildings that are potentially threatened, that we're investigating those early and bringing attention to those early before before you're trying to scramble at the end. This picture I have here, the Green Mountain Lookout, when the Washington Trust kind of assessed their most endangered list, this was the one that was the longest campaign. The year we did that, it was 23 years, and that was 3 or 4 years ago. So it's probably, well, I guess it was 23 years from the time that it was listed as endangered to the year it was saved. So that time frame didn't change, but just shows you 23 years of advocacy, and there were lawsuits and bills passed by the House, by the legislature to save this building. It was a long battle, but we were successful in that one. St. Edward Seminary is what I've got up there for representing partnerships, because sometimes you get sort of one person who can come in and do it all and save a building, but more often than not, it takes a lot of partnerships to save historic buildings. And the St. Edward Seminary is a really great example, because the building is actually in St. Edward State Park, and it is a partnership between a private developer and the parks, the state park system, to get an agreement where the developer could save the building. It's now literally just opened this month as a lodge and restaurant and spa, which is super exciting. I actually had the opportunity to visit it. It was really wonderful. But this beautiful historic building will continue to serve our Washington state community for many, many more decades to come, because of that partnership that was successful. And the last one, together, you're more powerful than you think. This is the Morgan Middle School in Ellensburg. And this is a fun example, because the school district wanted to tear this building down, and the community to build a new one and upgrade the school facilities. And the community said, well, why don't you just upgrade the historic one and keep those historic memories that the whole community has, grown up with. And I want to say it was 3 different levies they tried to pass, and the community kept voting it down, because they wanted, instead of the new building, they wanted this building to be rehabilitated. And the local group, Modernize Our Morgan, actually raised enough money to do an assessment and showed that modernizing the historic building was roughly, I think it was roughly equal, or maybe even just slightly less money than tearing down and rebuilding a new school. So they finally got the funding to go ahead and do that rehabilitation. And it took a lot of years, and it took a lot of grit for the local community, but they were successful. So those are some fun success stories that demonstrate kind of different types of advocacy that nonprofit groups are sometimes involved in, like Historic Tacoma, although these examples are statewide, like I said. Here are a few ways that you can get involved. Excuse me, if you're interested in joining the work of Historic Tacoma, you can follow us on social media, attend events, pay attention to the landmarks meetings. I won't read the whole list, but there's lots of great ways to get involved, and you don't have to be a board member to participate. And you're being involved tonight by attending the workshop. So thank you for that. All right, now to the register side of things. What does historical designation mean, and where did it come from? So in the United States, the formal preservation, sort of codified into laws, began with the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And that was spurred by the demolition of Penn Station in New York, which I've got a picture here, which is very sad to lose that one. But there was a lot of preservation happening before that, definitely on the private level. Lots of big, historical figures' homes were preserved. But this is really when it became codified into law. And this national act spurred a lot of laws then across all of the states, because this national act basically created the mechanism by which each state would then also have their own historic preservation office at the state level. So as I mentioned before, for us in Washington, that's DAHP or DAP, the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. So that law, that 1966 law, also created the National Register. it requires a review you might have heard of called Section 106. And then, as I mentioned, it established the nationwide network of state historic preservation offices and really gives those state historic preservation offices the sort of jurisdiction to manage preservation in that state, and the National Register as well. So again, I'll talk a little bit about that distinction in just one second. But I do want to distinguish between National Register, Washington Register, Tacoma Register. It's a little bit confusing. They're all a little different, and they all have a little bit different requirements. I wish it was a little bit more straightforward, but we're going to talk about it tonight, what they all mean. And I've got a little graphic here that shows you who manages each of these. They're all the same basic idea of sort of a list of important buildings, but they all have different rules and regulations or no regulations, depending. And so we'll go into that a little bit. So here in the local level, it's the City Landmarks Preservation Commission who determines who is to be listed on the local Tacoma Register. And then it's actually the City Council who has final approval on that. So the commission makes a recommendation to the City Council, and they do the final approval. For the State Heritage Register, DAHP or DAP has kind of full reign of that. They manage it at their office, and then they have the Washington State Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is a statewide group of preservation professionals who volunteer to serve on that committee, or council rather, and makes the decision for the state register. And then for the National Register, that same council that manages the state register also reviews everything for the National Register. And then once they've reviewed it and approved it, they do send it to the National Park Service. And that's kind of almost more of an administrative step. It really is that review at the state level in partnership with DAHP that determines what gets listed on the National Register. So it's important because it's all recorded at the National Park Service, but it really is that state office that has a lot of authority to manage that National Register, the listings from Washington State. So most registers, whether local, state, or national, and in other states too, kind of operate on a few basic principles. So you have to have age and integrity. So usually there's an age threshold of a building needs to be typically 50 years old. That's the national standard, and that's what we use here in Tacoma. I have a little asterisk on this section though, because in King County, it's 40 years, and the city of Seattle is 25 years. It really is, whatever the jurisdiction decides, but 50 is kind of the national standard. And then the concept of integrity of, does it still look and feel the way it did in the past, is kind of a shorthand for, can you tell by looking at it and experiencing it that it's a historic building, and that, that it represents that past that it's significant for, which is the other piece, which is significance. Typically that's events, people, historic architecture, these types of things are what we do research on to just determine if there's significance for that property to be listed. And then another another category is like that archaeological category. Most registers have, if it potentially has archaeological value, that's another way for it to maintain or to possess significance. And I want to pause here for just one second, because the historic preservation world is definitely evolving. And I think both the concept of integrity and the concept of significance is definitely in flux right now. So traditional preservation would say integrity means it has to be like in really good shape. It has to have all of its original materials. It cannot have had alterations. And what we're really realizing now and within the last 10 or 20 years is that buildings change over time, and that doesn't make them less significant to their communities or even to historical events. Like the changes that buildings undergo also represent the sort of progress of history, if you want to call it that, you know, the changes of history, and that in and of itself holds significance. And also some areas of significance aren't as straightforward as an important person, you know, built it or an important architect designed it. Sometimes that significance is more based in community and factors that are a little bit less tangible than a famous architect. And so you'll see that in some registers, there are more areas of significance being considered, more diverse stories, and then also that integrity piece of the integrity not being quite as strict, but allowing for some of those changes to demonstrate the significance of a building over time. It's not perfect, certainly, it's still an evolving process, but those are some of the changes that are happening in the preservation world, at least here in Washington, where I work, and I'm really happy to see it. Still a long way to go, but those are some of the really positive changes that are happening in preservation right now that I wanted to be sure to note, even though the structure we are working within with 4 registers is pretty much, it's written down in city code, and we do need to work with that, but some of the attitudes are shifting a bit. So I've got this flowchart here to sort of demonstrate the process of historic preservation, or excuse me, of register listing and how it differs between local, state, and national. And I'll zoom in a little bit here. This flowchart is one I actually created while I worked at the Washington Trust. So I've got other topics here like property easements and initiate an advocacy campaign, which we're not going to focus on this evening because that's a whole other topic. So we're going to focus on these 3 columns over here, which are the listing column, like how to get a building listed. So you'll see up at the top, I have these different sort of end goals. We've got, I want to protect the property, I'm looking for financial support, or I want an honorary acknowledgement. And you'll see that the lines connect where they do. For historic preservation in Tacoma, the only register that offers protections is our local register. And that's pretty typical across the country. The state and the national register definitely doesn't offer any protections. It offers some financial benefits, but it doesn't protect a property, and neither do national registered districts either. It really is that local level where protections are managed. And every city, every municipality writes their register language differently. So some are more protective than others. And Tacoma's actually is pretty good as far as registers in Washington go, in my experience. As far as the steps of getting registered, the first step I have here for all 3 is review the requirements. They're different for all 3. They're different for all 3 registers. They have similar concepts behind them, but each of the pieces of information that are requested are slightly different. I mean, if you're doing one, you probably are gathering enough information to do all 3, but the forms are different, so you do need to be sure, you know, which register you're going for and which form you're using. For our local register, you'll need to talk to our city staff. And then for either state or national, you'll need to contact DAHP. And I've got hire a preservation consultant down here as kind of a dashed lighter box, because depending on how much you already know about your property, whether or not you're looking to get tax credits. There are a bunch of different factors that would make hiring a preservation consultant make sense. It certainly would make it a lot easier because they have a lot of expertise in research and writing, but it's not necessarily required. If you really want to list your building or your house, if you are interested in doing the research yourself and you're willing to kind of put the time in to kind of write it in a description in this format that's necessary for the register, you can definitely do it yourself. But there are consultants out there that can help you. So that's something to consider if you're interested. And then the next step is to go ahead and prepare that form. So the form, like I said, is different for each 3, local, state, or national. Again, very similar components, and we'll go a little bit into the Tacoma form this evening. For the local register, you'll work with the staff of the city office. For the other 2, you'll work with our state architectural historian to kind of finalize and make sure the form is in great shape for it to be reviewed. Submitted is the next step, and then reviewed by the local landmarks board, which for us is the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And then, as I mentioned in that last graphic, both state and national are reviewed by our Washington State Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And then the last steps here, I've got this sort of dashed line for national that goes straight to state also, because in most cases, if someone is nominating something to the National Register to the DAHP and it gets listed on the National Register, they'll say, it's important enough for the national, it's probably also important enough for the state, so they'll just sort of automatically usually add it to the state register also. Here's that little circle that says DAP submits it to the National Park Service, to the keeper, and then once sort of received and approved by them, the property is added to the National Register. So for the National Register, properties are potentially eligible for historic preservation tax credits, which are for income producing properties only, so typically more commercial properties. And depending on the jurisdiction, potentially also special tax valuation, which is a state tax credit, if you don't have a local jurisdiction that offers that, which we do in Tacoma. So you'll see that over here in the local side too. For our local process, I have, depending on the municipality, the nomination may also be reviewed by another body, which, as I mentioned before, is our city council. And then once they approve it, it's designated a local landmark and is eligible for that, potentially eligible for special tax valuation, which again, I will be talking about a little bit later. Future changes must be reviewed by the local landmark board. This is the protections that I mentioned before. Is there's no review like this that happens at the state or national level. It's really only at the local level. So whenever there's sort of a major exterior change to the building, it has to be reviewed by the commission. This is a great graph that is from the nomination guide that the city of Tacoma has produced. Basically just kind of mentions all of the steps that I just mentioned, other than that they mentioned that there is a public hearing. So in this Tacoma process, so the commission reviews it. There's another meeting for the public to comment, and then there's the meeting at the city council to finalize. So that's our local process. A little more detail on our local process here. And so I have this other chart here about benefits and protections. As I mentioned, the Tacoma Register is the only one that offers protections. National and state are honorary only. National does offer National Historic Tax Credit eligibility, which is great. And then our local register offers our state tax credit, which again, I'll talk about in a little bit. A little bit of information about who reviews our local landmarks. Our Landmarks Preservation Commission. It's a volunteer board managed by our city preservation office. It involves 3 architects, 3 sort of professional preservation people, and then 4 at-large citizens. And I see Lauren throwing more info in the chat as well, or in the chat, yeah. And then the commission also it has sort of non-voting members from local historic districts if they want to send a representative, and we have right now a representative from the North Slope and the Wedge district who regularly come to commission meetings. And the commission meets at 5:30 on the 2nd and 4th Wednesdays of the month. And right now they're meeting digitally, so you are more than welcome to join in. It's a public meeting, or a publicly available meeting. And normally in normal times it happens at City Hall, but right now we're meeting virtually. So there's 2 ways that a building can be listed on a register. They can be listed individually on their own. So you fill out a form that addresses one building specifically. You definitely talk about its context, but it's just that building that's being nominated on its own. Or you can have a district, which basically draws a boundary line around a geographical area that, as you can see in the second bullet here, they all kind of share a special historic character and relate to the same historical development pattern in a city. So they kind of all contribute to the historical narrative, or the story behind the development of that neighborhood. Districts can be all residential houses. We've got several great residential districts, or they can be more commercial based. It doesn't, there's no use restriction. It's just all about that story of how that place came to be, and how the group of buildings together tell that story. And within that district, that first bullet, you can be either contributing or non-contributing, which basically just means, there's new and old sometimes mixed together, or old buildings that have been changed too much. So in order to take advantage of the preservation benefits, you do have to be one of those contributing buildings, which basically you have that integrity to demonstrate that it's part of that story, and also meets the age threshold. So that's what kind of being contributing means. So if you're a non-contributing building in a district, like a new building, you're not restricted to the same types of review that a contributing building would be. And then in Tacoma, we also have this little thing, just briefly want to mention, it's a conservation district, which is a lower form of review. There's more, there's kind of looser rules. Typically, as you can see here, it's kind of the buffer zone between the protected district and other areas nearby. Changes are reviewed by the commission for buildings in this area, but as I said, the rules are much less restrictive, and there's a lot more that's allowed. But that's another kind of mid-level that we have here in Tacoma, which is interesting. And then here's a list of, I think this is accurate, and Lauren can jump in if we're missing any. College Park is our newest district in Tacoma. These are the districts that are currently designated on the various levels. As I mentioned, it's just these local districts that get reviewed. So anything listed individually on its own, because it's very significant as an individual building, gets reviewed, and then any of the buildings that are contributing in any of these 4 districts here also get reviewed by the commission. We have other great historic districts in our city that are listed at the state and national levels. Again, it's a great honorary designation, but it doesn't offer the same protections. In Tacoma, we do have basically a line in our city ordinance where if something is listed on the National Register, the commission will basically review it. It's not subject to the same rules, but if someone is proposing demolition, but it does have to be reviewed by the commission. So there's that rule that Tacoma has created for our community for buildings on the National Register, but that's not typical and certainly not universal across communities. So that's something special that Tacoma has decided to add to our preservation rules. All right, so back to the topic of integrity and significance. Integrity, the qualities of integrity are location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So any of those elements that still exist and are able to convey that history, that story that I mentioned before, that you need that combination of kind of that sense of or feeling of seeing a historic building plus that significant story or backstory combined is what makes something eligible for the register. And then here's another slide of these qualities of integrity. And you really only have to satisfy one. Often buildings satisfy many. In fact, most satisfy most, I would say. But there's a pretty wide-ranging interpretation of these qualities of integrity, and I think they do an interesting job of sort of capturing the essence of a historic place, like feeling and workmanship. Like workmanship is different than design. There could be an interestingly crafted building that isn't necessarily high style architecture. So I like that it includes these other qualities as well. So here are the criteria for our local register. So in addition to having that integrity of those qualities I just had on screen, these are the elements of significance that a building has to convey through those qualities. Again, only one is needed in order to be eligible for the register. And there's a lot of options here. Kind of as on an earlier slide, which I was talking about kind of the national movement and the general significance factors. Our local Tacoma list mirrors that pretty well for many of the criteria. So we've got, significant events, people, design. The prehistory or history is kind of that archaeological one that I mentioned. And these two down here are more unique to Tacoma, adjacent to or related to another historic structure or district. And then F is kind of an interesting one, basically that it's so singular and unique, and it's so familiar of a feature of the city that makes it significant in and of itself, even if the architecture is difficult to identify or has changed. Like just being a really important visual component of the city is an element of significance that we recognize here in Tacoma. So that's a really interesting one to consider. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about our specific register form, just because it's fairly lengthy, and if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of that, we can certainly assist you with that. But I threw a link in the chat to a PDF that the city produced, which is really great. It literally walks you through everything you need to know to put together a nomination. And I'll just go ahead and skip forward to the next slide. It's basically split into 3 parts. one, sort of basic property info, so parcel, address, owner, that type of thing. And then there's a section for the physical description. So what's its context, what's its architecture, does it have any unique details? And then how has it changed over time? As I mentioned before, just because it's changed doesn't mean it's not eligible anymore, but it is important to relate those changes to that story you're telling about the building, and kind of demonstrate how this building has, you know, existed in the community through time. And then the third section is that sort of significance piece, the story behind it, who designed or built it, who lived there, worked there, when, important events, how does it fit into that story? So that's a very wide-ranging potential section. And notice it says historical and cultural. So it can be a little bit more inclusive than just kind of the sort of standard narrative of history that sometimes preservation gets a little stuck in. And I have these 3 images here. These are from the guide. One is, well, we've got a house and then two larger structures. It actually gives like a pretty good example right in the guide of how you might describe those buildings, their physical and historical and cultural significance. So I think the guide does a really nice job of demonstrating the type of description that is usually necessary for the register form. And so really be sure to check that out if you're interested in that. And also I have a link to another PDF I'll drop in the chat, which is one that Historic Tacoma produced about architectural styles in our city. It's a few years old, but not a lot has changed about a lot of our historic buildings, which is really, really nice. So check that out if you're interested in that as well. And one other thing to check out is that we hosted a historic research workshop as part of this McKinley project with the city as well, which is on YouTube. And our friend Katie Pratt at Northwest Vernacular, she's a preservation consultant. She goes through all of these great resources that you can use to do research, and basically kind of breaks it down piece by piece. Like how do you look at the architectural style? How do you find out who lived there? How do you find more information about it? And she really does a great job and drops a lot of resources in that workshop. So another great resource to check out. And then the cover of the city's guide is there on the slide too, as a resource for you. So just a couple more slides and check time. We're running a little low on time, so I want to keep moving quickly. What does it mean to be listed? What are the effects? What happens afterwards? So special tax valuation is a pretty big important one for some folks. It means that you can basically have a lower assessed property value, which I'll get into in a minute. Conditional use permit for some historic buildings, if they're in an area, a particularly zoned area. For some, there is an allowance to use it for a different purpose than what it's zoned for. There's rules about that, what exactly all is allowed where, and just because you are listed doesn't mean you automatically get that. There's a process, but that's a potential benefit. Transfer of development rights is something that, again, if a building is in a zoning that allows for a taller development, for instance, and you're not planning to build on top of your historic building or demolish it to build something taller, that's something you're giving up. And so if you basically transfer that to another project, you can receive a benefit from that. Design review, we've talked a little bit about. Our commission reviews changes, which is very much related to demolition review. It's a very similar process. Obviously, demolition is a very big change that's being proposed, and they have, for listed buildings, the commission has to review it, and the commission can can deny a demolition permit or recommend that the council doesn't deny a demolition permit for a listed building. So the two I want to focus on are the special tax valuation and the design review. So for that special tax valuation, how it works is you have to do a rehabilitation project. So you do have to sort of spend money to get the benefit. And basically there's a list of qualified expenses that the city recognizes as sort of contributing to the preservation of the property. So you spend a certain amount of money on rehabilitating your property, and then that amount of money can be reduced from the new assessed value of your property. So basically, if you improve your property, the assessed value is going to go up, and the state recognizes that. And so as sort of an incentive that you can collect over time is, if you go ahead and spend that money to improve your historic property, you can deduct that amount you invested from the value of your property, the new value that's higher, because they want to take away the disincentive to improve your property. So essentially, you're not being punished for, punished is kind of the wrong word, but you're not being given higher taxes for investing in a historic property for a period of up to 10 years. And the second bullet here, in some cases, a project's costs, so the amount someone spends, exceeds the assessed value for a property even after the rehab is done, which means you don't have to pay property taxes if you participate in this program. And like I said, and the cost exceeds. So the Elks building is an example of that here in Tacoma. They just opened a couple of years ago, and they took advantage of this tax valuation, and I believe it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 39 million that they spent on that building that qualified. So they'll be able to reduce $39 million from their property value for tax purposes for up to 10 years, which is great. Here are the sort of nitty-gritty details of this program. On the right-hand side, you'll see basically a fact sheet. I'm going to throw that link in the chat as well. It outlines the qualified expenditures, which things count as an expense that can add up to your total rehab cost for deduction. In order to take advantage of the program, you have to be listed, as we've mentioned. Your rehab costs have to be at least 25% of the assessed value before you start. So it needs to be sort of like a substantial project. The program, you have to do the work within a period of 24 months. So it can't count for something you did 10 years ago. You kind of have to limit it to a certain time frame. As I mentioned, qualified expenses only. Changes you make have to meet the historic standards. The Secretary of the Interior is from the National Park Service. So it has to meet those standards, and then may not adversely affect the building's historically significant character, which is essentially the same as following the standards. And in Tacoma, if you're making major changes to your property, and you're a listed landmark, you'll have to also be reviewed by the commission. You can do the work first and then list your property and get the benefits, but again, you still have to follow the historic standards as laid out here in the state requirements. So what does design review mean in Tacoma? Most exterior changes do need to be reviewed by the commission. A couple big exceptions to that are definitely paint color, that is not reviewed. Roofing is also not reviewed, but most other kind of changes or anything more than sort of routine maintenance does need to be reviewed. So those changes need to follow the design standards. And on the right, you'll see the cover to the standards we refer to most often, I think, in our work at the Commission, because it's the districts, I think, that have the most, the buildings, the North Slope and Wedge residential districts. This is the guidelines that we refer to a lot. And as a commission, it's really important to sort of apply the rules equally across all applications for changes, which I think the commission does strive to do, and in my opinion, does pretty successfully. But I'm definitely biased. So the two basic principles. I mean, the design guidelines have a lot of very specific rules that are laid out. So if you have a property in a district or listed, definitely refer to those to know what you can and can't do. But the two basic materials are keep as much historic material as possible, including siding, windows, all that great historic stuff. And if you do have to replace it, and usually the only reason the commission allows you to replace it is if it's really deteriorated beyond repair, anything you use should match the original pretty closely, and be the same type of material. So it doesn't really allow for, hardy plank siding to replace wood siding, if that's as an example of a replacement. So being listed and design review does not address the use of a property, and doesn't really actually apply to the interior either, unless the interior is also designated, which is actually a little bit of a new thing for Tacoma. In the past, it was only public buildings that could have interiors designated, but there was a change in the code a year ago or so, maybe a year and a half, where now, if you would like to be listed, if you have a very special sort of entryway or grand library or something in your in your property, and you want it listed and protected on the interior as well, you can designate certain spaces in an interior to be listed in addition to the exterior. In which case, then the commission would also review that. But for the most part, most landmarks and listed buildings, it's just exterior changes. Design review does not mean you can't alter or build additions on your property. It basically just means that the historic features have to be sort of remain prominent, and anything that you're altering or adding generally needs to be sort of positioned toward the back of a building, sort of less visible from the public right of way, certainly kind of removing as little historic material as possible, that type of attitude. So it doesn't mean that it can't change. It just means that it's there's a design sort of ethic of preserve the historic materials, and then again, it gets reviewed by the commission. So last, and I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the Q&A, so I'm just gonna carry on, I think, to the end of the hour here. The last slide I've got here is why do historic places matter? And I think that these are some of my personal reasons, but it certainly doesn't encompass all reasons. And I think everyone kind of has their own thoughts about this and has their own places that they connect with. And so those places can influence why you care about historic buildings. For me, I think historic buildings have a lot of character, and I really love the types of kind of community and experience that historic preservation and historic buildings foster. And I think Tacoma has a really great built environment that I love living in and enjoying every day. Preservation certainly connects us to our past and can help preserve irreplaceable design and construction. And then another great one is that the greenest building is the one that's already built. So preservation helps us sort of manage one aspect of sustainability. And if we're able to reuse a building, maybe make some upgrades, you're going to be saving a lot of resources that would otherwise go into not only tearing something down, produces a lot of waste that goes into landfills, but also building a new building takes a lot of resources, and things like concrete are very carbon intensive. So there's a lot of benefit to using the buildings that we have, upgrading them, and making them comfortable for us today, while also enjoying their beautiful architecture and the stories that they embody about our community. I've got a great quote here by anyone in the preservation field will be familiar with Jane Jacobs and her work. And if you're not, she is a wonderful writer and sort of philosopher and thinker from the mid 20th century, who really championed not only historic buildings, but communities and people sort of working together to build strong communities that relate, which related to her love of historic buildings and passion for historic buildings. I won't read the whole quote here, but she talks about new ideas using old buildings. And I love that idea because as she says, something that's chancy or experimental, old buildings give you those flexible spaces, those maybe cheaper spaces that new ideas and entrepreneurship can take advantage of. And so it provides this sort of gradient of types of spaces in our community. And just because you value historic preservation doesn't mean you can't also appreciate a new building where it's needed. I think one of the best things about having a preservation mindset, in addition to the sustainability aspect, is my second to last bullet here, which is managing growth in a way that's thoughtful and protects those historic aspects that are really important, while allowing for the change and growth that a city needs to be healthy and thrive. So that is all I have to present this evening. As I mentioned, I don't see anything in the Q&A, so I'll give it a minute or two if folks have thought of any questions, either about preservation generally or historic registers specifically. I threw a lot of charts and graphs at you, so if any of those sparked any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those. All right, Lauren says no Facebook questions either. We did get streaming to Facebook, which is great. So yeah, I think we do have a comment. Thank you, Erin, for attending. I'm glad you enjoyed. Feel free to contact Historic Tacoma at any time if you have questions about preservation in Tacoma, registers. The city folks are definitely the experts on all the details of the register, but we do have a pretty good working knowledge, and as a volunteer commissioner myself, do interact a lot with the city, and so we can help you if you have questions or are just interested in learning more. So, and Lauren threw in an email address to contact about nominations if you're interested. So thank you everyone for joining. Again, the link to our McKinley History Project is on the screen if you want to learn more about some other workshops and events that we're doing, and learn more about what we research in that community as we learn more. So thanks everyone.
Thank you.